Welcome to week 6 of the Portal Quilt Sewalong. I'm so glad that you're here. I hope you're having fun with this. I have thoroughly enjoyed seeing your progress photos, both in our Wisecraft Quilts Facebook group and also when you have tagged me on Instagram. It's fun to hear that some of you are working together on this project in small groups, either virtually or together quarantining in your home. We are now at week 6. Week 6 is all about sandwiching the quilt layers and quilting ideas. I'm going to admit to you that I am not there yet. I had some other things that took precedent last week in the studio, so I am still in the process of sewing the centers onto both of my quilts, both the hand sewn centered version quilt and the machine sewn version quilt. And interestingly enough, I'm ahead on the hand sewn version because I can do it anywhere, so I often do it in the evenings. But I'm still working through, just a little bit slower than usual, but as I've said many times, you're not behind if you're not ready to do what each new week brings. For those of you that are ready, let's talk about sandwiching the layers first. And I always advise to make your backing and your batting layer when you're sandwiching your layers at least 4 inches larger than your quilt front. So that's going to ideally give you 2 inches on all 4 sides. Sometimes I say add 4 inches on all 4 sides, but somewhere in between there is fine. The goal is you want your backing and your batting layer to be larger than your quilt front until you are finished with whatever quilting you're going to be doing. I have a free class and I will link to it below. It's free to join and it is all about backing and batting. I go through what my favorite types of batting brands and lofts are and why. And I also go through how to sandwich the 3 layers 2 different ways. I will link to it below, as I said. So now let's talk about quilting options. Here's my portal quilt, and the quilting that I did for this was super simple. I decided that I would stitch in the ditch through all of the blocks. The reason I did the stitch in the ditch part was because I just could not focus on one idea for quilting the background of the block, so to speak. So I did that, and you can see what I did right in here. So I just went through and stitched every single one of these around the blocks here. The other thing that I did was the centers on this one, I hand stitched them on. They weren't all exactly straight, meaning sometimes after I needle turn appliqued them, they were a tiny bit askew. So to minimize the appearance of that, I decided to use my walking foot to stitch around each center through all the layers, so quilt around the outside. And let me tell you how far. I think that was just the width of my walking foot. Yep, so it was a quarter, so I stitched or quilted a 1/4 inch away from each square, so that way everything looked straighter than if you were to stitch or quilt right beside of all of these edges that you needle turn appliqued. That's going to emphasize the needle turn applique, which a lot of times we like to do with our quilting. However, in this case, to give the illusion of, or to sort of give the overall appearance of everything being straight and uniform, by just taking the quilting a 1/4 inch away from the edge, it just sort of de-emphasizes anything that's slightly not straight. And I'll turn it again over on the back so you can see how I stitched each one of those. Now when I use my walking foot to quilt, I usually make the stitch length a little bit larger. I think that a slightly larger stitch length looks better. Of course it goes faster, but I started at one end. I started my quilting stitch there. I took a back stitch or two. I came down to here. I took a back stitch. I raised my needle. I pulled my quilt through to the next edge and did the same thing. And I did that all the way down the quilt and all the way across the quilt. You're not twisting and moving your quilt all underneath the harp space of your sewing machine. Then what I did was went through with my snips and just snipped each thread in the front and in the back, and that's all I did. The other thing you could do is you could tie this quilt. If you don't want to try any walking foot quilting or free motion quilting, you could definitely tie this quilt. It would be fun to tie at each of these corners where the blocks meet. It would be fun to tie maybe around each of the corners of the center. There's a lot of different things that you could do. If I were going to free motion quilt this on my home sewing machine, I would probably do some sort of free motion quilting in the darker valued squares of each block, just because when you free motion quilt onto the surface of your quilt, that area is going to be pressed down a little bit more. So it's going to be more in the shadows, so to speak. So that would sort of help emphasize the value differences between the light and the dark values within each square. So you could go through and just do something in each of the darker valued areas of the blocks and leave the light value areas of the blocks unquilted. So that is your assignment for this week. Thank you all so much for joining in on this. We've got one more week to go, and that is binding. So, thank you all. Have a great week, and I'll see you next Monday with our final week.